If you've watched all the episodes in this series so far, then you know what the plan was, you've seen what happened, and you know the outcome. Now we have to ask the question that has sparked controversy ever since. Who was to blame for the failure of Operation Market Garden? This was the biggest airborne operation of all time and the last major defeat of the British military. Historians have come up with a host of reasons for the failure of Market Garden, and we're going to delve into them today. If you've watched from the beginning of the series, you'll have seen the battle as it happened, but just so we're up to speed, let's quickly recap. The plan was to take all the bridges between Eindhoven and Arnhem using paratroopers and create a corridor for British tanks and infantry to drive up and over. We saw how the initial landings went well, and we've seen how most of the bridges were taken without much trouble. Only a small portion of the British paras got to Arnhem Bridge, but they held on until the 4th day of the operation. The Polish had dropped 5 days later and fought well to try and support the British on the opposite side of the Rhine. Somme Bridge had blown, but was rebuilt by the 101st and by 30 Corps, who made good the delay and raced towards Nijmegen. Here they fought a tough battle for Nijmegen city and the bridge, which, as a result of the determined and heroic effort of the soldiers of the American 82nd Airborne, saw the capture of that bridge. Sadly, despite the efforts of every Allied soldier up and down the corridor, the Germans had delayed them long enough to prevent them from taking the final bridge, Arnhem Bridge. As General Browning had supposedly said before the battle, it was a bridge too far. It may come as a shock then to hear that immediately after the battle, Sosabowski, the commander of the Polish forces, was relieved of command and blamed for the failure of Operation Market Garden. This may seem a little strange, and it was. Because of bad weather, the Polish had landed 5 days after the beginning of the operation, and despite a portion of their force jumping into the jaws of the enemy, they'd fought hard to support the British trapped at Oosterbeek. Why then was Sosabowski relieved? How could he be blamed for the failure of Operation Market Garden? The truth is that at the time, a scapegoat was needed, and the Polish were an easy target. Some have even suggested that the Poles are only included in the battle just in case it did go wrong. After the war, historians started to look deeper into the reasons for the failure of the operation, and nobody now thinks the Poles were to blame. But let's look at 3 of the main arguments for the failure of Operation Market Garden. The first argument is that it was a rotten plan, poorly executed, to quote Max Hastings. Now, there are a few variations to this popular and traditional argument, but the basic principle is this: the entire operation was a failure from its conception. It was an overambitious plan, created in haste by a poor general, and the major mistakes that were made mainly by the British units in the battle. And it was the British that ultimately should take the blame for the failure of the entire operation. This argument makes clear that the ignored intelligence reports of the enemy tanks, the landing zones miles away from the bridge, not being able to land the entirety of the airborne divisions at once, faulty radios, and a host of bad decisions by commanders like Horrocks and Urquhart essentially proves that the operation was poorly executed. So 1st Airborne failed to get most of the troops to the Arnhem Bridge on day 1. They were too eager to fight the Germans, then get to their objective. They were dropped too far away from the bridge, their radios didn't work, so they became disorganized. 30 Corps wasn't hasty enough in driving up Hell's Highway, especially after getting across Nijmegen Bridge. They delayed when they could have pressed on towards Arnhem, and may have gotten to Frostmen in time if they had only done this. And as General Gavin of the 82nd said, 30 Corps were 36 hours delayed before reaching Nijmegen, and as a result they were never going to get to the British at Arnhem in time. For this argument, blame is usually placed on one of the British generals. Montgomery, despised by many people for many different reasons, often receives criticism for coming up with this rotten plan. Urquhart receives a lot of criticism for accepting landing zones miles away from Arnhem Bridge, and for accompanying 3rd Battalion, slowing them down, and for getting trapped in a house with his second-in-command Lathbury, and for not making it clear who was to take command of 1st Airborne if he and Lathbury were lost, etc, etc. So yeah, Urquhart had his fair share of the blame. Equally, it's also fair to say that Browning is the one who should have taken the blame, since he made plenty of mistakes as well. The most noteworthy of which is dismissing the intelligence reports of the German tanks in the Arnhem area. But Browning also takes criticism for taking vital transport aircraft from the British and therefore weakening 1st Airborne on the first vital day. And let's not forget Horrocks, whose slow advance up Hell's Highway effectively doomed the operation. Proponents of this argument usually say 30 Corps took every opportunity to stop, rest, drink tea, and generally didn't perform so well. And once they got the tanks over the Nijmegen Bridge and the road ahead was clear, they stayed there and drank tea, despite an American paratrooper offering to go with them to Arnhem. So a few variations of who is to blame, but this argument is the one that has been ingrained in the minds of the majority of people when they think about Operation Market Garden. The massively popular film A Bridge Too Far probably did more than anything else to cement the popularity of this argument. A lot of the books that focus solely on the Arnhem part of the battle tend to agree with this argument too, because, as has been pointed out time and time again, the British made a lot of mistakes at Arnhem. So do you agree with this argument? Let us know in the comments. The second argument is that, wait for it, the Germans were the reason for the Allies' failure. Yes, surprisingly, some people think it wasn't as much as an Allied defeat as a German victory. Robert Kershaw, in his book It Never Snows in September, is adamant that the Germans outfought the Allies during Market Garden, despite having to rely on eyes and ears battalions and other unfit and reserve units. And when you look at the evidence, the Germans did a remarkable job with the little resources they had left. All they had was 2 depleted panzer divisions, not even at half strength, backed up by Kraft's force, which is actually part of 16th Panzer Grenadier Division. So you could make the claim that there were 2.5 panzer divisions at Arnhem. They also had Panzer Brigade 107, which successfully harassed the 101st Division, and the super successful 406th Division. That was more of a brigade than a division. But despite having a lack of men and equipment, the Germans were able to concentrate this ragtag force and throw them at the enemy and win this battle. Training their units to fight rather than march, improvisation and the creation of Kampfgruppen or battle groups, and the initiative of their leaders were all decisive factors that ultimately allowed the Germans to prevail. Kampfgruppe Spindler at Arnhem was decisive in stopping the rest of 1st Airborne reaching Frost at the Bridge. 10th SS Panzer Division fought at Nijmegen in a similar situation to Frost at Arnhem. They delayed 30 Corps at Nijmegen for 36 hours. It was the Germans who cut the corridor in the final days of the battle, and it was the Germans that came to the conclusion that it wasn't the British landing zones being too far away from Arnhem that was an issue. It was that a 2nd Airborne Division had not dropped into the area west of Arnhem. This argument raises the question, was it more of an Allied defeat or a German victory? If you support this argument, let us know. And the final argument makes the case that the battle was lost, not at its inception, not at its planning, not even by the Germans, sort of, but by the decision not to capture the Nijmegen Bridge on day 1. This newer argument makes the case that the original Market Garden plan was thrown out as soon as General Gavin of the 82nd made the decision to deprioritize the capture of the Nijmegen Bridge and focus his division on the Groesbeek Heights. Without the capture of Nijmegen Bridge, there was no way 30 Corps could get to Arnhem in time. Supporters of this argument also make the case that 30 Corps wasn't delayed before they reached Nijmegen, they were delayed 36 hours at Nijmegen. They also point out that it was Gavin who later claimed 30 Corps was 36 hours behind schedule before reaching Nijmegen Bridge. So basically, because Nijmegen Bridge wasn't taken on day 1, the Germans were able to block the road to Arnhem, and therefore the operation was doomed. It wasn't that 30 Corps was too slow, as the first argument suggests, but that they suffered too much of a critical delay at Nijmegen. The whole point of the operation was to lay an airborne carpet for the tanks to roll over, and the bridges were therefore the priority of the operation. Market Garden failed because one of those bridges was ignored for a few hours after the initial landings, allowing the Germans to secure it. Gavin certainly comes under flak by supporters of this argument, since he made the original decision to deprioritize Nijmegen Bridge, but blame also goes to General Browning, command of the whole airborne part of the plan, since his hand was in that decision too. When asked who made the decision to prioritize the Groesbeek Heights rather than the bridge at Nijmegen, General Gavin's response was, "This decision was made by myself and approved by my corps commander." As a result, it's fair to place the blame on General Gavin of the 82nd Airborne and his superior, British General Frederick Browning. So there is a basic overview of the three main arguments for the failure of Operation Market Garden. Keep asking it, but which one do you agree with? Now, having seen the battle unfold, it's hard not to come to the conclusion that the operation was lost at Nijmegen. Gavin and Browning failed to take a bridge, which was the one thing they had to do. The objective of the whole operation was to take the bridges, and they simply didn't do it. And whilst you could say it was the Germans who held the Nijmegen bridge for so long, it was only because Gavin didn't send troops to take it until the early evening of the first day, by which point it was too late anyway. It's almost as if it was an afterthought. There is this fact floating around that 30 Corps was 36 hours behind schedule by the time they reached Nijmegen Bridge. But this is actually something Gavin said after the battle to bend the truth. 30 Corps was at Nijmegen at the beginning of day 3 of the operation. So 42 hours after the beginning of the operation, since it started in the afternoon, they couldn't have been 36 hours behind schedule. They'd gone 50 miles out of the 58, and they got into Nijmegen with time to spare. Unfortunately, not enough time to spare to fight the 10th SS Panzer Division, but if Nijmegen Bridge had been taken by the 82nd, it's likely they could have reached Arnhem by the end of day 3. Because the 82nd hadn't taken Nijmegen Bridge, it took 30 Corps and the bravery of the 82nd troopers paddling across the Waal another 36 hours to get across the bridge. Nijmegen cost 30 Corps a day and a half, and as a result, caused Frost troops to be overwhelmed, caused 1st Airborne more casualties, and caused the failure of the entire operation. British troops at Arnhem were not relieved, and if they had been on day 3 or even on day 4, it's reasonable to assume that 30 Corps could have been across the Rhine. So why didn't they take Nijmegen Bridge on day 1? Now the obvious problem is that most of the 82nd Airborne had been ordered to guard the Groesbeek Heights. Now you could say yes, they needed the heights because it was their landing zone. But the issue isn't that they guarded the landing zones, the issue is that they guarded the landing zone with as many troops as they did, and also flew in artillery to pound the 1,000 tanks in the Reichswald, rather than take extra troops that could go towards Nijmegen. And Warren, who in the end sent 1st Battalion towards the bridge, wasn't told to take Nijmegen Bridge until the evening of the first day. There is a debate still ongoing as to whether Warren was issued pre-drop orders to take Nijmegen Bridge or not. He insists that he wasn't until around 7 or 8 PM on day 1. Prior to this, he had been ordered to dig in at the Groesbeek Heights, which he had done. The blame therefore rests on General Gavin for not sending anyone towards Nijmegen. Because Gavin feared an attack from the 1,000 German tanks that were meant to be hiding in the Reichswald, he placed priority on taking the Groesbeek Heights to protect his flank against attack. Except there weren't 1,000 tanks in the Reichswald. In fact, there is no evidence that anyone other than Gavin thought there were any tanks in the Reichswald at all. The German 406th Division that did move out on day 2 of the operation could barely be called a brigade, as I said before, and the first time any German force worth mentioning came out of the Reichswald moved out on day 4. At that point, the battle should have been over anyway. Gavin made the initial decision not to take Nijmegen Bridge. This was a poor idea, and Browning, as Gavin's superior, should have questioned Gavin's decision to take the Groesbeek Heights. Browning should have ordered Gavin to make Nijmegen Bridge the priority once again. He didn't do that. Why? Because he wanted to be on the ground to command the operation from the front, and he wanted the glory of leading a successful operation from the ground, and also setting up his headquarters on the Groesbeek Heights would allow him to direct the battle in theory. In practice though, Browning did next to nothing practical when he was actually on the ground. So rather than telling Gavin to change his plans, he reinforced them, which ultimately proved to be a disastrous decision. Browning also makes several other disastrous decisions, like dismissing the intelligence reports about enemy tanks. So if you come to the conclusion that it was Browning's fault, you can certainly argue that case. But ultimately, the failure of the operation was at Nijmegen, and when asking who was to blame for the failure of Operation Market Garden, you have to blame the person who changed the plan to suit their wants. And the evidence here points to General Gavin. The thing is, Gavin knew his head was likely to roll. To quote Max Hastings in his book Armageddon, Gavin of the US 82nd urged that the US Army should review its policy of ruthlessly relieving formation commanders who failed in a single battle. He argued it might be wiser to allow general officers to gain experience and to enjoy at least a second chance, because he'd messed up. He was urging this because he was responsible for the failure of Operation Market Garden. Basically, he was begging to keep his job. I'm going to recite a lengthy but relevant quote from John Frost. By far the worst mistake was the lack of priority given to the capture of Nijmegen Bridge. The whole essence of the plan was to lay an airborne carpet across the obstacles in southern Holland so that the army could motor through. Yet the capture of this, perhaps the biggest and most vital bridge, in that its destruction would have sounded the death knell of the troops committed at Arnhem, was not accorded priority. The capture of this bridge would have been a walkover on D-Day, yet the American 82nd Airborne Division could spare only one battalion, as they must at all costs secure a feature called the Groesbeek Heights, where, incidentally, the HQ of Airborne Corps was to be sited. It was thought that the retention of this feature would prevent the debouchement of German armour from the Reichswald in Germany. This armour was there by courtesy of rumour only, and its presence was not confirmed by the underground. In fact, as a feature it is by no means dominating, and its retention or otherwise had absolutely no bearing on what happened at Nijmegen Bridge. Thus, who was to blame for the failure of Operation Market Garden? Gavin. But I'm certain some of you will disagree, which is why I told you right at the beginning that this was a controversial battle. The myths surrounding Market Garden have been burned into history. I hope we've made a dent in those myths today. Of course, history does not stand still. Tomorrow, new evidence or a new theory could come along and sweep away the conclusions we make today. But until then, I'd like to hear who or what you guys think is ultimately responsible for the failure of Operation Market Garden. Do you agree with the conclusions of this documentary? Hopefully you don't, because that's what's great about history. It's not just about facts and figures, it's about arguing. And we all like a good moan. This certainly won't be the last documentary I make, so make sure you subscribe to be notified of more. I hope this has been entertaining and enlightening. Thanks for watching, thanks for subscribing, bye for now.